And the recording has begun. Yeah. Yeah, so hello, family. Welcome to the 12th session of the Family Discussion Group. This is a milestone for many reasons. We started 6 months ago, amazing participation of the family, so many speakers from Gen 1 to Gen 4, a huge collaborative effort. Everyone worked so hard at it, a first time for some at speaking in front of an audience. So many wonderful subjects: COVID, family, social media, gender, skills, movies, and more. I think we picked topics that were topical at the time. And a lot of that credit goes to Chand, a collaborator in this effort. He picked a lot of these topics. And of course, the eager participation of the family from Australia to the US, staying up late, waking up early. FDG is now an established format, a part of the family calendar. Excuse me. Thank you so much for your wonderful support and encouragement. Your depth of knowledge, your experience, your wisdom is what makes this family so special. Thank you for sharing and for listening. So let's get on with the session, Decoding the US Election. I always give my take at the start for a couple of minutes, so here goes. 2020 will be remembered for two things mainly: the pandemic that caused so much pain and changed the world, and the US elections that caused so much anxiety, drama, confusion, disbelief, relief, and also entertainment for the world, and changed the world too. My evenings changed, my TV channels changed, my news sources changed. Never watched so much of Fox News, in addition to CNN and BBC, and YouTube and Russian TV and CGT and the Chinese TV. Everybody was talking about it. One often heard of MAGA, Make America Great Again, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, QAnon, Hunter Biden, Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani, conspiracy, Trumplicans, radical left, impeachment. Didn't hear too much about the American dream or we the people. The US election process is an enigma, to put it mildly. The oldest standing democracy in the world, now over 230 years old, started in 1789. The Constitution starts with we the people, but this was not about all of the people. It was a different time when this construct happened, with ethnic and gender exclusion. Inclusion came very slowly over the next 200 years. Some would argue it is still has some way to go. Make America great again. Well, America was and is great in many aspects. Not so much if you are Black, an immigrant, or a Muslim in some places. Great divides still exist. There are many stresses in the system. Now, a new element has emerged, which is amazing. This is the class divide, which is probably the greatest divider today. In a very unusual situation today that the far right and the far left are talking the same language, pandering to the same constituency. The racial shift has happened in quick time from 90% to only 60% white, and about to fall below 50% in the near term. These are what are shaping the narrative today. Combine the situation with four more: the antiquated electoral process, different in 50 states, the Electoral College, and more that we will hear about from the speakers today. Governance by late night tweets, dystopia of disinformation. These are Fareed Zakaria's words, not mine. And the wide divide on emotive issues like gun control, etc. I have traveled extensively in the US in all directions. Texas is a state that considers California and New York as foreign countries. It is a Republican bastion. I have many friends there, all Republicans, oilmen and ranchers and their families. In one of my many visits to the state, I was dining in a fancy restaurant in Houston with 7 friends, 2 ladies and 5 gentlemen. I noticed that Clayton on my right was carrying a gun on his hip, and asked him why he brought a gun to a social dinner. Ranu, I don't want some crazy guy to walk in through the front door and start shooting. I'll get him first. Intrigued, I asked the others if they had guns too. There were 6 guns on my table. including one each with the two ladies, all Texans. The only exception was my friend from New Zealand also visiting. And the minimum guns with each of them in their homes was 40. One had over 120 guns. But I'm concerned about the geopolitics as a result of the last 4 years of American politics. The America First perspective leading to deglobalization and detachment from global imperatives, surrendering the space to the other gorilla in the room, the sanctity of treaties and alliances. Everyone is watching what will be the new American dispensation. Lots of them: Netanyahu, Iran, Salman, Xi Jinping, Putin, Boris, and of course, my friend Kim. But let the speakers talk about all this. I will now introduce the speakers who will declutter and decode many of these issues. We have 6 speakers today, the most in any session of FDG, 2 each from generations 2, 3, and 4, drawn from 4 of the 12 clans of the family: Sheila, Vimla, Urmila, and Yadavir. 3 are direct descendants and 3 are married into the family. 3 girls and 3 guys, ages from 21 to the mid-70s. And finally, they all live in America. Shobha Nair. So Shobha, married into Gen 3, has lived in the US since 1999. Until 2016, Shobha considered politics, for the most part, a spectator sport where, beyond voting, her involvement was limited to the occasional dinner party debate with friends. The election of Donald Trump was a wake-up call that brought her into becoming a foot soldier in the effort to resist the erosion of democracy and work towards getting Democrats elected to Congress and to the presidency. Marching, donating, phone banking, and canvassing for elections. Shobha is a partner at Co-Creations, a consulting firm specializing in operational and cultural transformations. She has an MBA from XLRI, Jamshedpur, and a master's in education from Sarah Lawrence College, New York. Shobha is the leader of this session today. Rajan Shankar. Rajan Bhaisab, married into Gen 2, emigrated to America in the early 70s. He's a 30-year veteran of AT&T, having retired as director of new product business plans. After retiring, he became active in town politics and served as district representative for Democrats on the Mayor's Council for Economic Development. In conjunction with the local Chamber of Commerce, he promoted an economic incentive program to expand small business presence in town. Rajan has also worked on 2 mayoral elections. He was outreach coordinator to various associations and business clubs in the town. Lekha Shankar, Lekha Gigi, Gen 2, an economics graduate from Miranda House, Delhi, migrated to America with her husband. She became active in local politics. She worked with the town's immigrant population to help them apply for citizenship and register as new voters. She also hosted numerous neighborhood improvement sessions. Recommendations from these sessions were presented to the Mayor's Action Committee. Lekha Gigi is an avid follower and an observer of national politics. Her analysis of political events and predictions are the subject of many heated discussions at family and friend gatherings. Daniel McCarthy. Dan, married into Gen 3, lives in Brooklyn, New York. Originally from Ireland, he emigrated to the US in 2014. His interest in the US and its elections can be traced to the age of 8, when he memorized the then 42 presidents in chronological order. Why did he do that? The list was in a newly purchased family encyclopedia, and it was the only page in the P volume that had pictures. He studied economics and history in Ireland. He subsequently focused on US foreign policy when he completed his MSc in the theory and history of international relations at the London School of Economics. He currently works in operations and technology transformation in JP Morgan's alternative investment service business. Mitali Modi, who has spoken on FDG before. Mitali, Gen 4, works as a project manager for a nonprofit that runs social media campaigns in association with the Democratic Party. She previously served on the New York State leadership team for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, where she organized events, hosted a podcast, and assisted with grassroots Twitter campaigns. She continued to create content for the Biden-Harris Digital Coalition and South Asians for Biden. She graduated with a degree in film production from California State University. She interned for Conan O'Brien at Warner Brothers Studios and performed improv and sketch comedy. After spending several years in stand-up comedy, she eventually pivoted into politics. Shravan Asthana, the youngest speaker in FDG so far, Shravan, Gen 4, attends the Schreyer Honors College in Penn State. His passion is to enter medicine after his undergraduate biology degree, but has an academic interdisciplinary approach. He conducts neurobiological research on spinal cord injury and autism spectrum disorders. He also has a sub-concentration in economics and is building a potential to operate in various sectors in healthcare as an MD. His interest in the US election stems mostly from the relevance of COVID-19. So family, these were the speakers, and I will now hand over to Shobha to take it forward. Shobha.
Thank you, Rana Mama. Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to see all your faces on this cold, snowy morning in Connecticut. And welcome to our session on decoding the US election. Alternatively called, what the bleep is going on over there? That was the question that Ranu Mama asked me when he first called to discuss the session. And it's a question that we've heard over and over again the last 3 months from just about everyone we know who lives outside the US. How does one country go from this guy to this guy to this guy, all in the space of 8 years? And how on earth did we go from this? Gaurav, you're on mute.
Yeah, I forgot I was on mute. Let me play it again.
We have come to the end of a long journey. The American people have spoken, and they have spoken clearly. A little while ago, I had the honor of calling Senator Barack Obama to congratulate him, to congratulate him on being elected the next president of the country that we both love.
And from there to this.
Last night, I congratulated Donald Trump and offered to work with him on behalf of our country. I hope that he will be a successful president for all Americans.
And from there to this.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
It is, as Ranu Mama referred to in his opening, a very long and complicated story, but we will do our best to pull forward the most important threads in the story in the next hour. Our session will have 2 parts and 6 speakers. The first part will be the facts, filtered through our eyes, but still the facts. This part will have me explaining first the context, the US system of government and elections. This will be followed by Shravan explaining the US in 2020, the COVID factor. That will be followed by Mithali explaining what happened in this election, voter behaviors, as well as post-election shenanigans. And then we move on to the second section, which is our opinion section. Here to begin with, Rajan Mosaji will present his perspective on why did things go down this way. This will be followed by Dan presenting his perspective on the implications of this election for US policy. And finally, we'll have Lekha Masi presenting a perspective on the future of US democracy post this election. So let's go to the first section, the context. The US Constitution actually sets up the structure and playbook for the government. The government has three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. But the important thing to remember is that they are set up to be co-equal, which means each is powerful as the other, and each with very specific powers to check and balance the other two. The legislative body at the federal level is called the Congress. And by the way, every time you hear us say federal, think central. So the parallel to the US Congress would be in India, the Parliament. Congress has two houses. The first is the House of Representatives. The equivalent in India would be the Lok Sabha. And the second is the Senate. Now, the Senate is kind of sort of like the Rajya Sabha in that the senators represent their states, but there are some big differences. The Senate is way more powerful. Its members are directly elected by the people. And finally, because each state gets two senators, regardless of the population, small states actually have disproportionate power in the Senate. And for a bill to become law, it has to separately pass both houses of Congress. So joint sessions in the US are purely for ceremonial purposes. In terms of check and balance powers, the House has the power to impeach both the executive and the judiciary, and the Senate has the power to actually remove the members of the executive and judiciary and remove them from office. The Senate also has the power to confirm judges and cabinet members. Now we come to the executive, which in the US system consists of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. And it's elected independently of Congress. So you can have a divided government that is president of one party and congressional majorities of another. The cabinet members in the US are not elected. They are appointed by the president, though they do have to be confirmed by the Senate. In terms of the check and balance powers of the executive, the president actually has the power to veto bills that have been passed by Congress and send it back to Congress. And once he does that, or she does that, hopefully someday, then it needs a 2/3 majority, not a simple majority to pass. The president also nominates the judges for all of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. And now we come to the judiciary. The judiciary consists of the Supreme Court and some other lower appellate federal courts. The Supreme Court in the US has only 9 judges, and all cases are decided by a full bench. In terms of check and balance powers, the Supreme Court has the power to strike down both laws and executive actions as unconstitutional. So, why was the US government set up this way? The fundamental reason was to prevent a tyrant. The colonies had just fought a really bloody war of independence to free themselves from what they viewed as the tyranny of King George and Parliament, and they were not about to let a homegrown tyrant take his place. And that's why they created this whole system of separation of powers and checks and balances. And it's really a system that requires collaboration and compromise to function. The interesting thing I find is that the founders were also design thinkers. So they set up a system that, they could test things and learn and then evolve it. And they did this through a provision and playbook for amending the Constitution. A constitutional amendment is a heavy lift, and you'll see that as we go along. But the provision does exist, and it has been done in the past. So now we come to the US system of presidential elections. The most important thing for all of you to just remember is that it is not a direct election where people directly vote for the president, and it is most definitely not a one-person, one-vote system. The Constitution actually sets up a special intermediary body called the Electoral College. And the sole purpose of this body is to elect the president, after which it's disbanded. And the members of the Electoral College are called electors. So these are some terms for you to remember. So how does this work? The Electoral College actually roughly mirrors the Congress. It has 538 electors, 100, which is the number of senators, plus 435, which is the number of representatives in the House, plus 3 members from Washington, D.C., which is actually not represented in the legislature. So each state has the same number of people representing them in the Electoral College as they do in Congress. What happens prior to election day is that each political party in each state actually picks the electors who will represent their candidate in the electoral college. Now we come to the question of who actually conducts this election. The states do. The head of the state election missionary is the Secretary of State of the state. That's a state cabinet position. And she or he oversees the civil servants and the small army of trained citizen volunteers who actually run the operation of conducting the election and counting the votes. Once the votes are counted, the state legislature formally certifies the election, and this decides who are the electors that are going to go to the electoral college from the state. Now, all but 2 states have a winner-take-all law for electors. What does that mean? It means that, for instance, if Joe Biden won 70% of the vote in New York and Trump won 30%, that doesn't mean that Biden gets 70% of New York's electoral votes. He gets all of them. Now, this was not in the Constitution, this winner-take-all, but it actually became the norm via state law in most states by about the 1820s. Okay, so what happens after the election? After the election, the electors vote for president and the electoral votes are sent to Congress. 270 is the magic number of electoral votes needed to get a majority in the electoral college and win the election. And the final step is that Congress formally tallies the votes of the electors and declares the winner. For the news junkies amongst you, that's a step that was interrupted on Jan 6th by the insurrection. So you're probably wondering, why on earth was the system set up in this utterly complicated fashion? The short answer to that question is that it was a compromise that no one thought was perfect, but everyone could live with. You see, in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, there were 2 opposing camps. Camp 1 thought that Congress shouldn't have anything to do with picking the president because it would mean too much opportunity for chummy collusion and corruption between the executive and the legislative branches. So these founders actually wanted the people to pick the president. Now, Camp 2 was really afraid of a popular vote. America at the time was a country of farmers and frontiersmen, and they thought that most people just don't have the education to critically evaluate issues, and a populist president with the backing of the Democratic mob posed a serious risk of becoming a tyrant. And that was their term for an authoritarian or wannabe dictator. So they debated and debated and debated. And when they got tired of debating and just wanted to go home, they came up with this compromise, which was intermediaries. States would elect a roster of independent electors, and the electors would actually elect the president. So that's how we got this utterly complicated system of the Electoral College, which at this moment has 2 giant problems, which actually make it incongruent with the foundational democratic principle of one person, one vote. So the first giant problem is that small states have a disproportionate power, both in the legislature and the Electoral College. So a vote in a tiny state like Wyoming, which has 600,000 people, actually counts 3.6 times as much as a vote in a large state like California with almost 40 million people. The second giant problem with the system as it exists currently is that you can have a president who lost the popular vote. It's happened 5 times in the past, and most recently with George W. Bush's first election and the election of Donald Trump. So now you're probably wondering, why on earth would we stick with this flawed system? Because to change it would require a constitutional amendment, and that is an impossibly high bar for this particular issue. A constitutional amendment has to be proposed by 2/3 of the majority in both houses of Congress, and it has to be ratified by 3/4 of all the state legislatures. And what that means in this case is that small states, of which there are many, would need to willingly give up their outsized power. And as we all know, that is just not typical human nature. So no chance of this thing being amended anytime soon. And that brings us to the end of this section. So over to Shravan now to talk about America in 2020, the COVID factor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in this section, we'll be talking about how did COVID impact the US elections. So let's get started. So there have been deficits all across US society and across the world. In our pastimes and our ability to connect with each other, our economic performance, absolutely. But one area in which there was an increase, converse to what we'd expect, was in civic society and in civic culture. So how did this impact our election? Let's first keep this map in the back of your mind. The more density of blue that you see, dark blue, is the more deaths of COVID-19 per 100,000. This is a great framework to have in your head where this is. I'm going to point out on the eastern and south areas in the density of metropolitans, but also generally in the south, there's a lot of COVID-19 death, a lot of COVID-19 incidents. And it's important to understand what are the trends. And as you see in California, it's not as severe, or as in the western side of the US, it's not as severe. So just keep this in the back of your head as we keep moving forward and looking at other numbers. So mail-in ballot access is widespread. Mail-in ballots is a way for you to send in your vote without actually showing up to a machine. It's obvious that in an era of respiratory disease transmission within 6 feet, it's not feasible to go within 6 feet and vote at a voting booth. So instead, you get mail-in ballots. If you look at the map, everywhere that is not gray will get you a mail-in ballot if you need it. The ones that are in gray, you can still receive a mail-in ballot, but you have to have a legitimate excuse, and sometimes they might put up a fight. But in general, it's pretty widespread. The difference is there's actually a very large deviation in who is requesting the mail-in ballots. Remember California, they didn't have nearly as many COVID-19 deaths, but they by far requested the most mail-in ballots. If you look at the rest of the United States, the more and more blue you see, the more and more mail-in ballots requested. So for example, in the northeastern part of the United States and in the southeastern part, in that panhandle we call Florida, which generally has more people over 65. Next slide. All right. So in this one, I'm going to break down, for the next few slides, I'm going to break down a couple data points on mail-in ballot requests. So by party affiliation, it's very clear. Democrats had a 10 million ballot request lead over registered Republicans. This is reporting from several states. And this is a trend that I think is very clear and automatic, is that Democrats by far prefer to vote by mail. By race and ethnicity, I think Ranu and Anand accurately said that there are around 60% white individuals in the US. So we don't see a major discrepancy by demographic, at least in North Carolina and South Carolina, which are pretty representative states. We don't see a major discrepancy from the average demographics within the United States. So it's not necessarily by race and ethnicity totally, although that it does play a big factor. By age and by gender, just to be complete, just wanted to show you what the purpose of mail-in ballots is for, right? Remember, we're in a COVID-19 era. 32%, nearly 1/3 of 65 and up voters requested mail-in ballots. That's a significant change from 18 to 24 with an 8% margin, right? So we see that clearly those people who have been recommended by the CDC and by their doctors to stay home, they're the ones requesting mail-in ballots. If we look at gender, this is a little bit harder to pinpoint what is going on. We do know that females generally lean Democrat, so maybe that's it, but it's also harder to say. But clearly a big 15% difference between 55% female, 40% male reporting mail-in ballot requests. That's pretty significant, although it's a little bit difficult to say what that means directly. This is a great picture, right? So this is Donald Trump at a rally in the middle of a pandemic. So Usually when somebody is sick, you don't generally go next to them or stand next to them. But Donald Trump decided to bring all of them to one place and have a great time. And so, as you'll see in the picture, there are very few masks. In fact, there are very little or any. And if they are wearing masks, they're around their neck, which is not very effective if you know how to wear a mask. And he's throwing a mask into the crowd. And this is a very good picture to sum up his messaging around the pandemic. He doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about his people. And that's came across to voters in a very significant way. 30,000 coronavirus cases of any mutation, any strain, were reported due to simply his rallies. Let's go to the next slide and see what Joe Biden is doing. So you see Mr. Joe, some people are, wearing masks. Some people are within 6 feet. It's not perfect, but generally you'll see his messaging was around distancing and keeping people apart, and you must wear masks. Another thing you'll note is that there are cars in the background. Cars are generally about 6 meters, approximately 6 feet, generally 2 meters across. So that's an automatic social distancing that he implemented. And he's always wearing a mask. And sometimes he even wears sunglasses, although that's not known to protect against coronavirus disease. But yeah, this is, just look at the difference in the pictures. All right, so I'm going to tell you about, let's look at the difference between the pictures. Thank you. I'm going to tell you now about this paper. This is where all my numbers, figures, everything is coming from. This was a great paper published in a labor economics journal about COVID-19 pandemic. So what really happened, right? What do the actual data points suggest? Well, it's amazing to think that if coronavirus cases in the United States had been 5% lower, Donald Trump would have retained the presidency. Now think about that number, 5%. Let's think about so many hundreds of thousands of people have died, and yet only a 5% reduction in cases. Donald Trump would have still won the election. That, I think, is a very strong comment on the political divide and also the political situation in the United States, but also shows that COVID did have an impact on the election, much more than many would like to admit. If you think about what Trump lost in, and let's actually go back to the map I showed you of the COVID-19 cases. Donald Trump lost in the states which he had won in 2016 and in the swing states. Any states which were at the mercy of going to Joe Biden or Trump or were up in the air, with COVID, immediately he lost an edge. And it was seen that actually it wasn't just about emotion. People were driven by a practical policy consideration. They thought about, okay, we are seeing our people with immunocompromised conditions and our elder population, they are being affected adversely. We are seeing that we can no longer live our lives in a normal way. In 10 years, which president is going to implement health policy or support pragmatic health policy that's going to keep us healthy as a nation? And so as much as we might attribute voting to emotions or our own rationalizations of things, in the eyes of COVID, it was based on who was more pro-science, actually, who was more likely to enact policy that would make a change. And so to sum up this finding, I found a great quote from Mr. James Wilson, who is an outsider from the UK, but a well-known social scientist. He said, it is a testament to the strengths and resilience of US science that it has weathered the past 4 years. It can look forward now to a period of much needed stability and support from Biden's administration. And so that very accurately sums up the global scientific community. Speaking as someone who's in the neuroscience field, when you look at the way we've handled COVID and you look at the way the US people had voted because of it, it is a little promising. So I hope that this is good background and a good way to think about how COVID is involved as we go to Mithali now to see what really happened in the election. Let's get to the substance. Thank you.
Mithali, sorry, just before you start, I just wanted to tell the audience, please feel free to type any questions that you might have into chat. Gaurav's actually collecting up those questions, and he will pass them on to the speakers at the end of the session. Please go ahead and type your questions in chat. Over to you, Mithali.
Great. So actually, we can go to the next slide. And I'll just do a pretty brief breakdown of the two parties. So you have, on one hand, the Republican Party tends to be more conservative. They believe in smaller government with little to no safety net, and they appear red on electoral maps, which you will see shortly. And the Democratic Party tends to be more liberal. They believe in bigger government and as big of a safety net as is necessary, and they appear blue on electoral maps. So moving to the next. So just briefly, the 2012 election, as we know, Barack Obama won re-election. It was a pretty big margin of victory for him. His challenger, Republican Mitt Romney, got 206 electoral votes and 60.9 million popular votes, which was about 5 million less than Barack Obama, who got 332 electoral votes. In 2016, we have Donald Trump, who won 306 electoral votes and actually lost the popular vote with 62.9 million. And we had Hillary Clinton with 232 electoral votes and 64.8 million popular votes. You can go to the next one. And in 2020, we had actually similar numbers. So Donald Trump won 232 electoral votes with 74.2 million of the popular vote, and Joe Biden won 306 electoral votes and won the popular vote as well with 81.2 million. This was the highest voter turnout election since 1908, actually. More on that. So actually 2016 and 2020 had the exact same electoral divide with a couple of key differences. So in 2016, the winner of the 306 electoral votes, which was Donald Trump, lost the popular vote, versus in 2020, the winner of the electoral vote won the popular vote. That was Joe Biden. In 2016, we had a few faithless electors. Those were people who defected from what the person that their state selected to win the election and chose to change their vote. So the end result of that ended up being 304 to 227. And in 2020, there were no faithless electors. 2020 was a very high voter turnout election, though if you see the number on the right, 67% is still not great, but better than 58%. And as I mentioned, it was the highest voter turnout since 1908. Democrats, interestingly, had a disadvantage going into both elections, but in very different ways. So in 2016, you had Hillary Clinton trying to succeed two-term Democratic President Barack Obama. And the last Democrat to succeed a two-term Democratic president was actually in 1836, which was Martin Van Buren. And in 2020, Democrats also had an advantage because Joe Biden went up against an incumbent and actually beat him by 7 million votes, which is a huge deal if you take into account the fact that it was only the 11th time in US history that the sitting president lost re-election, and it was the first in nearly 3 decades, the last one being George H.W. Bush. So one might argue that there are blue states and red states, but it's coming to be clear that there are blue demographics and red demographics, starting with race, which you will see on the next slide. So these maps show hypothetical electoral breakdowns if only specific groups voted. So on the top left, you can see that if only people of color voted in the US, Democrats would not only win every single presidential election, they would actually win every single state as well. And the reason that this map is not broken down further into various race, gender, ethnicity, education level for the people of color vote is that no matter which way you slice it, this is always what the end result is, which is very huge. Next to it, you see if only women voted, Democrats would still win by a large margin, but they wouldn't win every single state. And if you look at the one to the right, if only men voted, Republicans would win by a large margin. And the rest of the images here are all the various breakdowns of white voters. So white people, white women, white men, non-college educated whites, and college educated whites. Whichever way you slice it, they vote overtly Republican. So here's a real example of this dynamic playing out in the 2020 election. So we have the usually reliable red state of Arizona, which swung blue for the first time since Bill Clinton won re-election in 1996. So in Arizona, we had very strong mobilization efforts targeting voters of color on the ground in that state, particularly with the indigenous Native American population. So on the left is a map of Arizona tribal lands, and on the right is a map of how Arizona voted in the 2020 election. So if you look, you can see that many of the areas that went blue match up nearly exactly to the Native American tribal lands. So they're a small but very mighty voting bloc. So here we have a bit of information on the often talked about youth vote, but it's slightly more complicated than that. So this visual shows how young people between the ages of 18 to 29 voted in the 2020 election, broken down further by race. So while Joe Biden won the youth vote by a fairly decent margin, you see that those margins tend to start to get a little bit different between youth voters of color and white youth voters. So over 80% of Black youth and Asian youth voters supported Joe Biden. That's very, very telling. And if you look at the third circle, you have the Latino vote at 74%, so not too far behind. But when you get to the white youth vote, there's a pretty sharp decline. 51% is literally half. And put quite simply, the difference here is that if you're sitting next to a youth voter of color, the odds are very high that they supported Joe Biden. And if you were sitting next to a white youth voter, you have there's a 50-50 chance that they voted for Biden or Trump. So keeping all of this in mind, it's not surprising that urban voters, who tend to be younger and more diverse, vote overtly Democratic. So this time around, actually, Joe Biden won the suburban vote as well, which can be attributed to a variety of factors, but one of them being that more people of color are moving to the suburbs than ever before. And if you look at the bottom half of the chart, you'll see that rural and small town voters are reliably Republican and overwhelmingly so. This one I will just touch upon briefly, but building on the last slide, the larger the metro area, the more Democratic it tends to be, and the larger the economic output of said metro area, the more Democratic it tends to be, and that number shrinks as you go to smaller metro areas. So, of course, nobody expected Trump to go quietly. So his strategy here was to start off by disparaging the vote by mail process to create distrust in that system. He also encouraged Republicans in several swing states to file lawsuits that would require mail-in votes to be counted on election day and not before. So the idea here is that it would make it look like Trump was winning on election day when suddenly these mysterious and suspicious mail votes showed up and stole his victory. And the third point here is that he planned to begin his calls to stop the count at the end of the day on November 3rd, with the assumption that he would be ahead in the electoral vote count, which you will see on the next slide. Unfortunately for him, this is what the map looked like at the end of the day on November 3rd. So he could say stop the count if he wanted, but he was still losing, and Joe Biden was ahead. So you might think, oh, of course, he would pivot to a different strategy, and that is actually not what happened, because he did not have a backup plan in case he was losing on election day. So instead, he went on a disinformation rampage. I'm sure everybody is familiar with his former Twitter activity. That was the biggest source of election disinformation. And then the image on the right, there's a funny story there that I can share later, but his cronies were out here caping for him essentially and spreading that same disinformation. So he then resorted to several legal attempts to overthrow the election. So he and his surrogates filed 86 lawsuits, and they lost all 86 lawsuits. They did not win one single one. They also proceeded to apply pressure on Republican officials, including Trump's vice president at the time, Mike Pence, Republican governors, secretaries of state, state legislators, Justice Department officials, and again, the success rate was an overwhelming 0. So here's one particular example in the state of Georgia, which was another once reliable red state that swung blue in 2020, thanks to the efforts of Black voters and also Asian and Latino voters. So Trump reportedly tried calling Georgia's Secretary of State 18 times before he finally answered, and intended to pressure him to magically find 11,780 votes. The image on the article on the bottom says that, so his response was that he lost, and that is the cold hard truth, and then hinted at possibly probing into the misconduct here. The interesting thing here is that Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger is actually a Republican, so it wasn't a partisan issue in this case. So when none of that worked, he then tried this.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
So that was at noon on January 6th, and approximately an hour and 15 minutes later, that led to this insurrection that everybody, I'm sure, saw on the news and watched with lots of shock, surprise, and horror. And you can go to the next slide. So eventually, later that night, Congress was able to reconvene to certify the electoral votes and declare Joe Biden the 46th President of the United States. That was concluded at 3:40 a.m. on January 7th. And you can go to the next slide. Shortly after that, Donald Trump was suspended from Twitter, and interestingly enough, election misinformation online dropped 73% after that happened. So I won't get into it too much, but one can't help but think what could have been avoided or what could have happened had he been suspended at any other point in the last 5 years, I would say. And then we can go next. So on January 20th, as per schedule, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were sworn in, and democracy prevails. So that concludes my section, and I will now turn it over to Raja Nana, who will share some hypotheses as to why this happened the way it did.
All right, Mitali. This is Generation 2 accepting the baton from Generation 4. Namaste to all the members of Das family. As someone pointed out, this is my first chat with the Das family. It took a long time to happen. I hope you find the wait worth it. For us to understand the American election, we should look at the Trump phenomena. In the next 10 minutes, I will introduce you to the Trump phenomena, to Trumpers, Trumpism, and the Trump effect. What are they and how they affect the political landscape? It was 4 years ago that Trump came onto the political scene. In short order, he captured and mesmerized a large portion of the Republican Party. So much so that today, Republican Party is called the Trump Party, and his followers are called Trumpers. So let's get to know these Trumpers. You've seen them at Trump's rallies. They are the ones wearing red caps with MAGA printed on them. MAGA stands for Make America Great Again. Trumpers are mostly white, middle-aged, with high school or less level of education. They work in farming and manufacturing jobs, earning about 30 to 50,000. They are in a small number in East and West, but concentrated in the South and Midwest. Their views are shaped by the news sources they visit. Their information comes not from CNN, not from New York Times, but from social media sites and TV stations alien to most of us. For example, they believe COVID-19 is not real. They believe climate change is not a threat. They believe science is nothing but nonsensical theories made up by the elites. A favorite website of these Trumpers these days is QAnon, QANON. This website promotes a conspiracy that a group of elites and Democrats in Washington worship the devil. They drink blood and they traffic in children. They are working to turn America into a communist or socialist state. It is really scary how many Trumpers believe in this gobbledygook. It was this conspiracy mindset that Trump exploited by telling the Trumpers that Democrats stole the election. The number of Trumpers is large enough to be a political force. In local and state elections, they have enough power to swing the election to candidates of their choice. You've seen their candidate, Congresswoman Green, a QAnon believer, a Trumper. She insists on carrying a gun into congressional sessions and has threatened several of her Democratic congressional colleagues, including the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. This group is angry, dissatisfied, and frustrated. Angry because they think America is changing for the worse. Dissatisfied because they feel American dream is getting difficult to achieve. Frustrated because they see political power slipping away from them. In Trump, they see their last big hope. So let's look at some of the reasons behind their anger and dissatisfaction. The first factor is the demographic change in the country. As the slide showed, over time, white population has decreased and non-white population has increased. In the next 20 years, non-whites are expected to overtake whites. This trend makes the Trumpers anxious and fearful. They see the impact of this everywhere, in the place of work, in school, and in neighborhood. These places are all undergoing a transformation due to a greater influx of non-white population. The second reason is the decline of jobs. Jobs that gave them middle-class status are moving away to other countries or being automated, or non-whites are competing for them. These two changes, demographic and loss of jobs together make for an explosive political mixture. These two changes explain why Trumpers become Trumpers. To put it mildly, they are unhappy with the direction of the country and want to reverse it. They are looking for someone to help them do this. In rides Trump with the answers. Trump projects an image of a tough, no-nonsense guy. He says he will make America great again. In other words, he will put Humpty Dumpty together again. To keep immigrants out, he says he will build the wall. To keep jobs from moving overseas, he says he will put tariffs. To restore law and order, he says he will put blacks in their place. What was a big no-no before, Trump has now brought it out in the open discussion of the white cause and white supremacy. The Trump effect is not limited to just the Trumpers I spoke about. It extends to Republicans in both houses of Congress and even to Republican governors. They fear his wrath. One word from him to his Trumpers, and he can make or break their political career. Well, of course, now Trump is gone. But the $64 million question is, what is the future of Trumpism? Will it continue? Will it get stronger? Will Trump himself come back in 2024? After all, the underlying forces I talked about, demographic changes and loss of jobs, are still there and likely to intensify over time. Right now, it would seem Trump effect is here to stay. Trumpers are still energized. Trump loyalists in Congress are still pledging allegiance to him. There is no sign yet of Trumpism fading away. Some political pundits have a different view. Among them, the well-known journalist and author of the book, World is Flat, Tom Friedman, thinks Republican Party may splinter, a Trump faction and a moderate faction. Over time, the moderate faction is likely to prevail because of its sensible and centrist policies. In the end, if we are lucky, Trumpism may turn out to be just a passing phenomena in the history of American politics. It is too soon to tell. All I can say, stay tuned and keep watching CNN. You never know when a breaking news may come your way. Thank you. And now I'll hand it over to Dan.
Dan, you're on mute.
Thank you, Rajan Pupa. So I will try and zip through my section fairly quickly. So Gaurav, just to warn you, I'm going to be flicking through slides as quickly as my words can carry them. So just a word of warning. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk very briefly about how policy is actually implemented in the United States. I'm going to briefly touch on how important the role of the actual president is in that job. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who Joe Biden actually is. I'm going to talk a little bit about his policy priorities, going to try and assess whether or not he'll be successful in actually implementing them. And then I'll speak to Trump's legacy and to what extent will that actually remain. If you move to the next slide. The key thing about the United States that you need to remember is that the states came first, the federal government came second. So domestic policy is heavily decentralized to the actual states. And unlike a federal system like India, tomorrow morning, the federal government could not impose its rule on an actual individual state. It's neither legally permissible nor, due to the likes of Ranu Chacha's friends, actually probably possible. So in reality, the federal government's role is limited and is kind of devoted to where it can solve collective action problems that most states typically manage, like defense and security. It manages federal land, which is over a quarter of the United States, and in matters of domestic policy, oversees and provides gaps in areas such as health, education, etc. So doesn't actually do the job, but provides oversight and funding. If you can move to the next slide. The key thing to realize, and I won't bore you with most of what Shobha actually managed, but the legislative branch effectively defines what the executive can do, what the presidency can actually do, and also controls the amount of cash that's associated with the amount of government, raises taxes, and basically manages the power of the purse, appropriates how that money can be spent. The most important thing to note at the moment is that the legislature is controlled completely by Democrats. Potentially, you would have an ability where the Democrats would only control the presidency, but the legislature could be actually managed by Republicans. In this instance, at this moment, Democrats control all the houses of Congress and the presidency. However, the key thing to note is that in order to get most things done by legislation to increase the power of the executive, you need typically 60 votes in the Senate. At present, there's only 50. And unfortunately, for the Democrats, it can be quite difficult for them to actually achieve all their 50 votes. If you just move to the next slide, let me introduce you to probably the most powerful politician in America right now, other than Joe Biden.
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this act because I'll always defend West Virginia. As your senator, I'll protect our Second Amendment rights. That's why the NRA endorsed me. I'll take on Washington and this administration to get the federal government off of our backs and out of our pockets. I'll cut federal spending, and I'll repeal the bad parts of Obamacare. I sued EPA, and I'll take dead aim at the cap and trade bill because it's bad for West Virginia.
So I think the key thing to note out of that is, though you may expect that politician to actually be a Republican, he's actually a Democrat. So his support is effectively required to get even the bare Democratic 50 votes. In order to get most legislation done, Joe Biden would require another 10 Republicans to actually agree as well. If you move to the next slide. Very quickly, the role of the president is to manage the executive. They've two major powers, or two major areas where they have the most authority, primarily in the areas of foreign policy. That is where they have the most leeway to do what they want. But probably the most important role within the context of the United States is that they set the actual agenda. They are the father or mother of the nation, and they have the ability to define the national conversation and manage the national mood. If we move to the next slide. So in recent years, there is a discussion in the United States on whether or not the presidency is actually a job you would want. Is it effectively the hardest job in the world? The key issue I think people have with the presidency is that they are held responsible for the people for events that they do not actually control. So if the economy is doing well, the presidency is doing well. If the economy isn't doing well, they're held responsible for something that they may not have the capability to instantly impact or manage. It's also fair to say that the skills required to run a presidential campaign don't actually lead themselves to perhaps managing the unmanageable job. The last two presidents were very effective at campaigning, Donald Trump and Barack Obama, but they didn't necessarily have what would typically be viewed as the experience typical to actually do the job. Trump never actually held political office, and Obama was only a senator for 3 years prior to him actually ascending to the role. So let's move on to the actual president now, Joe Biden. Joe Biden is actually the oldest man ever to take the job of president. He is also probably, I suppose, the most experienced. There are over 1,900 people who have been a senator in the United States Senate. Only 17 of them have more experience in the Senate than Joe Biden. And after that, he was actually vice president. He is distinctly unoriginal. He has never had an original thought, I would say, in his mind. When he first ran for president over 30 years ago, he had to drop out because he was caught plagiarizing a British politician's speech. However, he is distinctly non-ideological, and he typically reflects the balance of the Democratic Party, which at the moment, as I think was shown by Mithali, is got around 80 million people willing to vote for it and its agenda. He is distinctly underestimated. This time last year, people, if you looked at the betting markets in the United States, only 5% of the betting thought that Joe Biden would be president. And I suppose the most important thing about Joe Biden, from my perspective, is that he's an Irishman. Important to note that that may mean he's lucky, but he's actually had a fairly difficult life. He lost his first wife and daughter in a car crash. He lost his son to brain cancer in the mid-noughties or in the early 10s. And he has a certain level of empathy and emotion that a country like America kind of needs like now after it's suffering such a terrible pandemic. So let's move on to the actual policy agenda that he actually has. I'm going to skip through the domestic stuff really quickly, but basically, as I think has been discussed already, in this, his acceptance speech, after he won the presidency, you can see he had 5 main priorities. COVID, the economy, and equity were kind of the key items that shaped the campaign. He also spoke about healthcare and climate that are the key priorities of the Democratic Party. Moving on, let's go through what he intends to do with those policies. From a COVID perspective, like most of the West, the 2 key things that government needs to do is effectively roll out the vaccine, and his intention is to have 75% of the population vaccinated by September. He also is heavily encouraging schools to reopen, and he intends to have as many schools open within the next 100 days. There is a key difference between Biden's administration and the prior administration in that it appears to be far more interested in providing federal support to the states in order to make vaccinations in schools happen. Moving on to the next slide, the economy. The context of the economy is effectively bleak at the moment. The economy has shrank around 4% in 2020. The IMF predicts that it will probably grow by 5% next year. The key thing that he is trying to get through Congress is a bill that will effectively provide a fiscal stimulus. You can get a fiscal stimulus with only 50 votes. And the key question that is trying to be determined right now is whether or not he can actually choose to get his intended stimulus with just Democratic votes, or will he try to create a bipartisan bill? His big promise was that of unity. But the question is, though there might be a lot of popularity across the country for a large stimulus, it may not be as popular with Republican politicians. Moving on to the next policy area, healthcare. Really quickly, unlikely nothing will actually change in this space. It was very much discussed within the Democratic primary that you would try to provide potentially a greater government involvement in the actual American healthcare system, but it's unlikely that anything will actually change within the next 4 years. We'll move on to the next slide, talk a little bit about climate, or equity even. So major social unrest occurred after the death of George Floyd in the middle of the summer. And Democratic politicians, as has been outlined in prior speeches, typically tend to be the party of the minorities within the United States. The issue of equity tends to be subsumed into a broader cultural war in the United States. And a number of Trump's executive actions as president, designed to advance his base's culture wars objectives, have been actually reversed by the Biden administration. Whether or not you can actually introduce legislation to further the equity agenda is unlikely, but two areas to look at are whether or not there would be broader oversight of policing in the United States, or whether or not there will be an extension or protection of voting rights within the United States. So finally, climate, and this is where we kind of pivot towards foreign policy. Most Americans believe that climate change is real, but it is still a partisan issue within the United States. It is unlikely that you will actually see anything happen from a legislative perspective, but it would appear that there will be a large amount of executive action done by this administration. So they've rejoined the Paris Agreement that they can do without Congress or legislation, and they will very much focus on making the federal government green. So controlling the resources that they have, they will look to, for instance, making sure that all of the army will have electric tanks. It is unlikely that they will be able to do anything legislatively due to the prominence of the fossil fuel industry in the United States and in politically important states. Let's move on. So I'll move on, Gaurav. Don't want to look at what else. So what of Trump's policy legacy? So executive orders executed by a president can be undone by the pen. However, their impact may never be fully reversed. So an awful lot of what Trump has done to the United States from a policy perspective was done through executive order, and the reputation of the country, what has effectively happened because of what he did socially, especially within the immigration space, is not easily undone, but it can be reversed. His only prominent legislative achievement was large tax cuts, and it is unlikely that they will become, it is likely that they will become permanent as a consequence of horse trading. However, I think where Trump's major legacy will be retained will be in his foreign policy. That's where it will have its largest impact. His America First foreign policy was effectively unseen since the 1920s. He was isolationist. He was a firm believer that the United States should not engage in any foreign wars, heavily focused on reducing trade deficits with other countries, and it was exceptionally nationalist in the view that he didn't really care about the nation state as much as anything else, or international institutions, but was more focused on the nation state. So expressed in a vacuum, take Trump away from it, those actual sentiments are politically popular in the United States, and Biden's approach internationally will very much be focused on that. If you can move on. So Biden will be interested in foreign policy. He was a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He will re-engage with the world rules-based order, which Trump basically withdrew from. So rejoining of Paris, rejoining the WHO, ensuring the WTO, the World Trade Organization, can function again. Expect a more values-based foreign policy, where contexts such as human rights and democracy will be more to the forefront of foreign policy pronouncements. And he will most likely remain dovish on intervention. So ever since the Iraq War in the mid-noughties, which he voted for, Biden has been consistently against intervention in other countries. If we move on to the next slide. So his new national security advisor wrote a foreign policy paper, or co-wrote a foreign policy paper defined as foreign policy for the middle class. So US foreign policy elites recognize that globalization has created the space for populist insurgencies across the democratic world. The consequences of that has led to economic dislocation and the Trumpers that Rajan Prupa spoke to. However relatively important trade was to the economics of dislocation, it retains a totemic power politically. And it is unlikely that the supposed leverage that Trump achieved through his trade policy will be reversed without Biden making deals. So prior to Trump, there was a focus on using trade as a tool internationally, but the more protectionist approach associated with trade will retain. And it is actually worth noting that Biden's first thing that he did in the trade space was to actually reimpose a tariff on the United Arab Emirates. So moving on to the next slide. The key question is how to deal with the emergence of a newly bipolar world. So US withdrawal from the world has effectively developed a space for Chinese influence to expand internationally. And with the ascent of Xi Jinping, there's somebody in China who's very happy to expand China internationally. Trump effectively accelerated US withdrawal from the world, and the consequent antagonism he had with historic allies enabled further opportunities for Chinese expansionism. So the Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement in Asia, which was an American idea, the Americans have withdrawn from, and the Chinese are now looking to join. COVID has created a space where an underwhelming Western response has created more opportunities for Chinese ambitions, as China has weathered the pandemic fairly well. So the question is going to be whether or not Biden's advisors will actually, they're quite hawkish in China. And politically, he has been portrayed as being soft in China. So it is, on one side, there is a hawkish tendency that will probably make him hostile towards Chinese influence. And his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has spoken to the concept that he recognizes that China is effectively a competitor that needs to be competed with. If we can move to the next slide. Though he will be more assertive in the issues with regards to rights, the key question, when you look at things like the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, is whether or not they will actually impose actual material sanctions on the Chinese. Trade negotiations were initiated by Trump, but the deal that they've done with the Chinese has effectively been breached by the Chinese. So it will be interesting to see whether or not actually Biden will seek redress for the fact that Trump's trade deal has effectively been breached upon by them. But even within that context of where there is hostility, there are people within the administration like John Kerry and Susan Rice who have a more dovish approach towards China. And there is a question of whether or not Biden's focus on climate will actually soften the United States approach to how they actually engage with the Chinese. Similarly, North Korea and Ranu Chacha's good friend Kim, there is a question as to whether or not Chinese influence is something that the United States feel they need as a requirement to deal with the North Koreans. So over the next couple of years, the question is going to be how the dovish tendency versus the hawkish tendency within the administration interact with each other, and primarily how China actually engages with the broader world. There is a view that they will become more antagonistic towards Taiwan within the next 10 years, and that will influence how the hawks and the doves engage in the administration. So moving on, what are the implications for the Biden administration for the rest of the world? So really briefly, this is going to be the first administration in 30 years where there won't be a Russian reset. Bush, Obama, Clinton, Trump all tried to be friendly and thought they could negotiate with Putin. The presidency of Joe Biden will be actively hostile to Russia. American withdrawal and antagonism weakened the influence that the United States had in Europe. Europe has had an exceptionally weak response to the COVID crisis, and they have gravitated in different ways towards Russia for energy and potentially vaccines now, and China from an investment perspective. The key question is whether or not Biden can reverse that drift. Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. It is not the policy of the Biden administration to rejoin that deal. It will need to be strengthened, and the question will be after the Iranian elections whether or not the Iranians will want to renegotiate something that will look at more than just nuclear weapons. And finally, within the context of the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, which were viewed as the pinnacle of Trump's foreign policy achievement, where Sunni Arab states and Israel engaged, will remain. However, expect a cooler foreign policy with the Arab world, and you can see that that has already manifested itself in the United States saying that it will no longer engage with the Yemeni conflict on the Arabian Peninsula. So I have spoken far over time, and for that I completely apologize. Before we continue and move on to Leka Bua on the future, the only thing I would like to say is there is the old Chinese curse that we live in interesting times. The last 4 years have been very interesting in the United States. Joe Biden now has an approval rating of 61%, and that is probably because times are less interesting. And let's hope that time will be less interesting for the next 4 years. So moving on to you, Leka Bua.
Thank you, Dan. Since the 2020 elections, people have asked, what is going on in America? How come the president is questioning the election results? Is the election system broken? Is democracy dying in America? In order to get answers to these questions, we need to examine the election system, not just the election results. In order to trust the election results, we need to trust the election system. Now let's begin by looking at the state level. In all 50 states, Voting was conducted in a fair and honest manner, in accordance with each state's rules. Voters had free and easy access to record their votes. Furthermore, each and every vote was counted. Due to COVID-19, there was a greater emphasis on having voters mail in their votes. All 50 states handled this greater load of mail-in votes without any hitch. Trump challenged the results in 5 or 6 states. About 60 court challenges were filed by him. He lost all 60 of them. The courts refused to entertain these cases because of lack of evidence. Mind you, in these courts, many of the judges had been appointed by Trump. To their credit, they stood their ground. Most notable is the case of the state of Georgia. Not satisfied with the votes being recounted and recounted, Trump challenged up and asked publicly the Secretary of State in Georgia to fabricate enough votes so Trump could be declared the winner. As Shobha mentioned, the Secretary of State oversees the election process. The Secretary of State, himself a Republican, and who voted for Trump, refused to go along. He told Trump to his face that such an action would be illegal. Now let's look at the federal level. With no success at the state level, Trump's next move was to approach the Supreme Court. He was hopeful of getting a sympathetic hearing because 6 out of 9 judges in the court have a Republican leaning. 3 of those 6 had been nominated by Trump himself. Trump felt this was the payback time. But all 9 judges unanimously threw out his petition. In a last-ditch effort, he made a desperate attempt to incite his followers on January 6th. And we all know what happened as a result. So, what does this all mean? This chain of events proves 2 things. First, at state level, audits of the election process found no fraud. There was no evidence of voter suppression. The election process withstood and survived the attacks by Trump. Voter turnout was highest ever. Millennials and minorities voted in record numbers. This proves that roots of democracy are strong and deep at the state level. Second, at the highest level of the government, I mean the Supreme Court and Congress, both refused to entertain Trump's allegation of a stolen election. Both institutions demonstrated that they abide by the laws of the land and follow the Constitution. There is one final point, and this is really important. On November 3rd, 33 Senate seats and all 435 House seats were up for election. Also, 11 governorships were up for election. No one, and I mean no one, has questioned the election results in the Senate, House, and government level. Except for Trump creating political mischief, election results of all other candidates have been accepted by everyone. This shows election process is intact and strong. However, elections will come again and again. Political upheavals do take place from time to time. In fact, one such upheaval caused by Trump is currently rocking the Republican Party. It would be naive to look at this and walk away from the democratic process in disgust. So ultimately, what does this mean? What does the success of democracy depend on? As Obama said, democracy is not a spectator sport. As long as good and decent people participate and continue to vote, people like Trump will not be able to hijack democracy. Thank you, and over to you, Shobha.
Thank you, Lekha Mercy. So now we come to the end of our story. So far, America is actually still in the early stages of processing and making meaning of what just happened here. And in this meaning-making process, actually, many of us have found solace in the words of Amanda Gorman, the 22-year-old poet who spoke at the inauguration of President Biden. He said, "When the day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet, the dawn is ours. Before we knew it, somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. Not broken, but simply unfinished. And so we just commit and stick to it and keep on keeping on in the task of creating a more perfect union. Thank you. And thank you for listening to our story. And over to Gaurav now for the Q&A.
Yeah, so just a few questions that came up. The first one was from Chand Bhaiya for you, Dan. Do the parties in the Senate issue a whip, or is conscious voting allowed? And what happens to the people who vote their conscience?
So the whip system is not as rigorously applied in the United States political system generally. So there is no whip system in the Senate. There are bipartisan majorities at the throughout the history of the United States. The way you basically lose the whip, for want of a better expression, is that you will still be a member of a party, but if a party does not like what you do, the leadership can remove you from the committee positions that you can actually sit in Parliament, or when it comes to your re-election, they can contest you in a primary to make sure that you're not a candidate for the next election. But that's why the Senate system is quite unusual, and why they tend to be very independent and very powerful, because they only go up for election every 6 years. So therefore, more often than not, they can vote with their conscience. However, like every politician, they're very conscious of the fact that they may be up for re-election. So typically at the start of their term, they have more of a conscience, and towards the end of their term, when they get closer to re-election, their conscience disappears. There is no, to answer the question, there is no real defined whip system.
Great, thank you. The second question also from Chand Bhaiya is in the US, does the vice president have a separate specific role, like in India where he heads the Rajya Sabha? Shobha?
Yes, so there is no specific role. The vice president's job is a really important one because the vice president is one heartbeat away from the presidency and needs to take over as the president if something does happen to the president. But the vice president's role is not formally defined in the Constitution, and it's something that's typically depended largely on the relationship between the vice president and the president. So, for example, Obama and Biden had a wonderful relationship where Obama really had a lot of respect for Biden, and he was the last person in the room before a decision was made. And Obama actually gave him some very, very chunky, big projects to handle. For example, the TARP, the spending that was done to kickstart the economy at the end of the last huge Great Recession. Biden was in charge of implementing that. So he had a lot of very meaty projects. And what we've seen now with Biden and Kamala Harris is that they have an equally really close relationship. If anything, Harris spends even more time with Biden and is more a part of every decision that Biden himself even was during his time as VP. And here, there's also this whole thought that Biden is actually a very old man. So to me, as an outsider, it feels like he's really grooming her to be able to step in, God forbid, should the need be. But her formal role at this point is still in the process of being defined. Mitali can probably speak more to it, but my guess is that he's going to give her some really chunky, meaty projects to do, and they will be defined as it goes along.
Got it. So now from Shantanu Bhaiya, Mitali, for you, what is the outcome and implications of the impeachment proceedings against Trump?
So at this point, obviously, he's not in office, so they're not really going to remove him from office since he's not there. At this stage, what he is being impeached for is incitement of an insurrection. So the Democrats need 17 Republicans in the Senate to vote alongside them to convict him. The odds of that happening, in my opinion, are very low. But at this point, it's a referendum on the actions that he took. And it's like, you can't do nothing at this point, because then it sets a very dangerous precedent for the future. One thing that could potentially come out of it is that the Senate can vote to prevent him from running for office again in the future, which could be to the advantage of Republicans, could be to the disadvantage, remains to be seen.
Got it. Thank you. Shravan, for you on the postal ballot system, will the Indian community consider suggesting to the Biden administration that the postal ballot system be overhauled to become to overcome any reservations about its integrity?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is there value in suggesting to Biden to overhaul the balloting system so that the integrity can be maintained, or should it be overhauled? Yeah, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think that the consensus on the mail-in ballots was that there was very little, if any, widespread fraud in the US, despite all the disinformation. So I don't know if there's a very large reason to overhaul the system, but there should certainly be an optimization. If you saw the way a lot of even my friends objected to the way the ballots were being counted, was that each state did it their own way. So that just created confusion, if anything. And so people mistake confusion for wrongdoing instead of understanding that we have to rely on a postal system that is government funded. It's not FedEx or Amazon that'll get you your products in a day. It's the USPS, which will get your products in 5 months. If you're in the US, you know what I'm talking about. But no, seriously, the impetus to change the system is not one to overhaul, but more so optimize and improve efficiency.
Got it. Thank you. Rajan Wasa, Lekha Mosi, question from Bantu. How much power will people like AOC have, and what impact will it have on the Biden presidency?
Sorry, I missed which people? AOC.
People like Amanda Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah.
Well, they have a good presence and a good voice in the Democratic Party because the progressive wing is quite vocal about the agenda. So my view is that they will have some influence, like you see the $15 minimum wage that Bernie Sanders has been pushing. Very good chance of it coming through. As I understand, it's not in the package looking at now, but down the road, it should be there.
Got it. Thank you. Hey, Dan, here's one for you. With globalization on the decline, protectionism coming back, authoritarianism on the increase, will the movement to check white supremacy likely take hold in this climate?
I think it's fair to say that there will be a focus on white supremacy in the Biden administration. It was a term that was referenced in his inauguration speech. I think there will be a greater focus within the administration to potentially actually create a law or laws around domestic terrorism, because there's no domestic terror laws in the United States at the moment. I think there will be a lot of investment in dealing with disinformation that has led, I think, to perhaps the growth of white supremacy in the United States, and expect a focus, I think, though an awful lot of people don't necessarily like using this terminology, I think there will be a lot of fairly quiet efforts to engage in de-radicalization and de-radicalization programs within the context of the United States. Rajan Pupa mentioned the QAnon conspiracy theory, which doesn't equal white supremacy, but it's in the same lane. 6.8% of the United States population have a belief or think there is some value in QAnon, which is a staggering number of people. So there will, I think, be an effort to try to ensure that those conspiracy theories, as well as the views of the white supremacist views, are kind of denuded and reduced in the population.
Beautiful, thank you. I think, Ranu Mama, we've run really long, so I'm going to hand it back to you, and for you to close.
Wow, that was a fantastic session led by Shobha. Thank you so much, Shobha, for coordinating this. It was absolutely fantastic. Rajan Bhai Sahab, Lekha Jiji, Dan, Mitali, and Shravan. Thank you so much. These were very valuable contributions. What I hear is that since this system is not going to change, which I heard everybody speak of, we can look forward to some more confusion in future elections and some more entertainment in future US politics, and therefore we will enjoy the process in 2025 and so on. So great, thank you so much. It really decluttered a lot of what is not understood across the world, and I think even in the US. Thank you so much. I am going to talk a little bit about what the next 3 sessions are going to be, which is what I normally do. On the 21st of February, there will be a session led by Mona, who will talk about horticulture and gardening tips. We have a lot of gardeners and wannabe people like me in this area. So that'll be on the 21st of February. On the 7th of March, we will have a session led by Veena Jiji, which I'm really looking forward to. And this is going to be talking about demographic shift globally and the impact of demographic shift. And so that is going to be a very interesting one as well. On the 21st of March, we'll be talking about money, money, money. Okay, so that is what's going to happen on the 21st of March. So don't miss the money one as well, all right? This will be led by Vishu, and he's also putting together a very strong team to talk about it. So is that it? I think we can close now, Shobha, with your permission. Okay, thank you, everybody. It was wonderful. And, we had huge attendance. We had 44 windows at one stage, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to watch it again and again. Thank you so much. We're going to stop recording now.